She woke up in chains, her wedding dress torn to rags, being hauled across the desert like cattle to be sold. 3 days ago, Elizabeth Prescott was a Boston socialite on her way to marry a banker's son. A marriage she never wanted, a future she never chose. But fate had other plans. When a lone cowboy appeared on the horizon, guns blazing, she thought he was just saving her life. She had no idea he was about to set her soul free. What happens when a woman who has never made a single choice for herself suddenly has to fight for everything she wants? When the man who rescued her from chains becomes the one person who finally asks, "What do you want?" This is not just a love story. This is a story about a woman who discovered that the most dangerous prison is the one we build for ourselves, and the only person who holds the key is us. Sometimes the life that looks safe is actually the one that slowly suffocates us. True security doesn't come from money, status, or following someone else's plan. It comes from having the courage to choose your own path, even when that path is uncertain and terrifying. Elizabeth didn't just escape outlaws. She escaped the invisible chains of expectations, duty, and a future that was never truly hers. If you've ever felt trapped by what everyone expects of you, if you've ever wondered, is this really my life? This story is for you. If this message speaks to your heart, drop a comment below and tell me. Have you ever had to choose between what was safe and what felt right? Hit that like button if you believe every woman deserves to write her own story. And if you want more stories that remind you of your own strength, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because around here, we don't just tell stories. We remind you who you really are. Now let's begin. The last light of day was fading when Elizabeth Prescott woke up to a world filled with pain. Her wedding dress, which was supposed to be a beautiful sign of a new life, was now just torn rags covering her bruised skin. She pulled against the heavy iron chains that held her captive in the back of an old rickety wagon. What should have been the ride to her own wedding had turned into a dusty, hopeless nightmare under a brutal western sun. A gruff voice yelled from the front, "Keep this thing moving. A pretty little bride like her will fetch a handsome price once we get across the territory line." Elizabeth yanked at the chains again, feeling the cold metal dig deep into her wrists. How could this be her life? Only 3 days ago, she was getting ready to marry Harold Williamson, the son of a banker. Her father had arranged the marriage before he died to make sure she was taken care of. But destiny had a different, cruel plan. A band of outlaws had attacked her coach on the way to the church, killing her guards and dragging her away to be sold off like a head of cattle. The wagon slammed into a deep rut, making Elizabeth bite her tongue hard. She tasted blood, but she swallowed her tears along with it. She would not let these men see her break. The outlaw leader, a man named Salis with a wicked scar that ran from his eye down to his lip, reined his horse in to ride next to the wagon. "Almost sundown, boys. We'll make camp up on that ridge," he said, pointing a thumb toward a cluster of rocks up ahead. He looked down at Elizabeth, and a nasty grin spread across his face. "Don't you worry now, little bride. Just a couple more days of travel, and you'll have a brand new husband. He might not be the gentleman you were expecting, but a gal in your position can't be too picky." The other men roared with laughter, and the sound made a cold shiver run all the way down Elizabeth's spine. There were 5 of them in total, all hard-faced men with empty eyes, and hands that were always resting on the guns at their hips. As the wagon slowed to a stop, Elizabeth saw a plume of dust rising in the distance behind them. At first, she figured it was just a dust devil, which was a common sight out in the Colorado Territory back in 1875. But this cloud of dust was moving with a purpose, following their trail exactly. "Salis," one of the men shouted out. "We got a rider coming up on us, and he's coming fast." The leader squinted his eyes against the setting sun. "Looks like just one man." Salis spat onto the dry ground. "One man is no threat to us. Probably just some rancher on his way home." But Elizabeth kept her eyes fixed on that dust cloud as it got closer and closer. A tiny spark of hope began to glow in her chest for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The shape of a single rider on a horse became clear, moving with a steady and determined speed. "He is not slowing down," another outlaw said with a nervous tone, his hand drifting toward his pistol. The lone rider came over a small hill, and Elizabeth could see him plainly now. He was tall and broad-shouldered, sitting atop a powerful chestnut horse. A wide-brimmed hat hid his face in shadow, but the way he sat in the saddle screamed of a dangerous confidence. "That's far enough," Silas yelled as the rider got closer, pulling his own revolver. "This is not your concern, stranger." The rider slowed his horse to a calm walk, keeping his hands in plain sight, far from the guns on his belt. "Just passing on through," a deep, calm voice said, "though I cannot help but wonder why you have a bride chained up in your wagon." Elizabeth's heart hammered against her ribs as the stranger's gaze met hers for just a second. His eyes were as blue as a mountain lake and twice as deep. In that brief moment, something unspoken passed between them, a silent promise that changed the very air they breathed. "She's our property, bought and paid for," Silas lied. "We found her stranded out on the trail and are just taking her to a safe place. Is that right?" The stranger's eyes never left Elizabeth. "Ma'am, is that the way you see it?" Before she could even open her mouth, Silas fired a warning shot that exploded in the dirt right next to the stranger's horse. "I said, move on." What happened next was a blur of motion so fast that Elizabeth could barely track it. The stranger's hand moved like lightning, his revolver appearing as if from thin air. Two shots cracked through the evening quiet. The first hit Silas's gun hand, and the second hit the outlaw beside him in the shoulder. The other outlaws dove for cover as the stranger urged his horse forward, shooting with a calm and deadly aim. One man tumbled from his horse while another caught a bullet in his leg. The wagon driver jumped down from his seat and took off running, vanishing into the tall grass as bullets sang past his head. In just a few seconds, only Silas and one other outlaw were still on their feet, both of them hurt but alive. "The next bullet goes right between your eyes, Silas," the stranger said with a chilling calm. "Drop your guns and step away from the lady." Cursing under his breath, Silas and his last man threw their weapons to the ground. "This is not over," Silas growled, clutching his hand. "It is for today," the stranger replied. He swung down from his horse, keeping his pistol aimed squarely at the outlaws as he walked toward the wagon. Up close, Elizabeth got her first good look at him. His skin was tanned from the sun, his jaw was strong and covered with a few days of stubble, and his remarkable blue eyes seemed to look right into her soul. He was not a young man, maybe around 30 years old, with lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and hard times. "The name is Ethan Keller, ma'am," he said, his voice much softer now as he looked at her chains. "Let us get you out of these." "Elizabeth Prescott," she answered, her voice hoarse from lack of water. "Thank you, Mr. Keller." Ethan put away his gun and took out a small metal tool from inside his vest. "Now, hold real still." His hands were rough with calluses, but his touch was surprisingly gentle as he worked on the lock. Every time his fingers brushed against her skin, Elizabeth felt a strange warmth spread through her, chasing away some of the fear and exhaustion. "Where were they taking you?" he asked, keeping his focus on the lock. "I do not know," Elizabeth confessed. "They attacked my coach 3 days ago. I was on my way to my wedding." Ethan's eyes briefly met hers. "Your husband must be worried half to death." "He was not my husband yet," she explained. "And to be honest, I barely know Harold. The match was arranged." With one final click, the lock sprang open and the heavy chains fell away from her wrists. Elizabeth let out a sharp breath of relief, rubbing her sore, red skin. Ethan turned back to the outlaws, who were watching with pure hatred in their eyes. "You two start walking. If I ever see your faces again, I will not be so generous." "You are a dead man, Keller," Silas threatened, holding his bleeding hand. "Maybe one day," Ethan said with a grim smile, "but it will not be today." As the outlaws stumbled away, Ethan turned back to Elizabeth. "Can you stand up?" She nodded her head, but when she tried to get to her feet, her legs, weak from being tied up for days, gave out from under her. Ethan caught her just before she hit the ground, his strong arms wrapping around her. "Easy there," he murmured, his breath warm in her hair. Elizabeth felt him lift her up, holding her against his chest as if she weighed nothing at all. Being this close to a stranger should have terrified her, but instead she felt safer than she had in days. "My ranch is about 4 miles east of here," Ethan told her, carrying her over to his horse. "It is not much, but we have food, water, and a warm place for you to rest." "What about them?" Elizabeth asked, looking toward the retreating outlaws. "They will be too busy trying to survive out here without horses to cause us any more trouble for now." Ethan gently lifted her onto his stallion and then swung up into the saddle behind her. "Hold on tight." Elizabeth leaned back against his solid frame, too tired to even think about what was proper. As they rode away from that terrible wagon, she could feel the steady beat of Ethan's heart against her back, a rhythm that was strong and deeply comforting. The sun was finally setting as they reached the top of a hill, painting the whole landscape in shades of deep orange and gold. Down below, they could see a small valley with a simple ranch house, a barn, and a few corrals. A gentle stream of smoke rose from the chimney, a welcome promise of warmth and safety. "Welcome to the Lazy K," Ethan said, his deep voice rumbling against her back. "It is not a grand place, but it is home." For the first time in days, Elizabeth let a little bit of hope back into her heart, thinking that maybe, just maybe, she was going to make it through this. As they got closer to the ranch house, a young man came out of the barn holding a rifle. "It is just me, Jesse," Ethan called out. "You can put that rifle down." The young man, who could not have been more than 18 years old and had a wild mess of sandy-colored hair, lowered his weapon. "Mr. Keller, I was not expecting you back so soon." His voice faded as he finally noticed Elizabeth. "Who is this?" "This is Miss Elizabeth Prescott," Ethan answered, getting down from the horse and then reaching up to help Elizabeth. "She has had a very difficult time. Miss Prescott, this is Jesse Cooper. He helps me out here on the ranch." Jesse quickly took off his hat, showing a face that was still more boy than man. "Ma'am," he said with respect, "you look like you have been through hell begging your pardon." "Jesse," Ethan warned gently. "No offense meant, ma'am," Jesse said in a rush. Elizabeth managed to give him a faint smile. "None taken, Mr. Cooper. And you are not wrong." Ethan gave Jesse the horse's reins. "Take care of Sampson, would you? And then go fetch Doc Peterson. Tell him to come quickly, but that it is not a matter of life or death." "Yes, sir." Jesse led the horse away, stealing curious looks back at Elizabeth. Without any warning, Ethan scooped Elizabeth up into his arms once more. "Let us get you inside. My housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, will help you get cleaned up." The ranch house was simple but clean, with sturdy furniture that was built to be used, not just looked at. A kind-faced, gray-haired woman looked up from the stove as they came in, her eyes growing wide when she saw Elizabeth in her ruined wedding dress. "Good heavens," she gasped. "What in the world happened?" "Martha, this is Miss Elizabeth Prescott," Ethan said, carefully placing Elizabeth down in a wooden chair. "She was taken by Silas Turner and his men. I have already sent Jesse to get the doctor." Martha Winters wiped her hands on her apron and hurried over to her. "You poor, poor dear. Let us get you a hot bath and some fresh clothes. Mr. Keller, would you mind putting some more water on the fire to boil?" The next hour was a complete whirlwind for Elizabeth. Behind a screen in the kitchen, Martha helped her into a copper tub and began washing away layers of trail dust and pure terror. The older woman made soft, sympathetic noises as she saw the bruises and scrapes that covered Elizabeth's pale skin. Martha mumbled, "Those men were nothing but animals. You are lucky Mr. Keller happened upon you." Elizabeth could not help but flinch when Martha started to clean a rather deep gash on her arm. "How did he even know where I was?" Martha just shook her head. He had no idea. Mr. Keller was just making his way back from Denver after selling off some horses. I suppose it was just Providence looking out for you. Martha had found a spare nightgown and robe in an old chest which she said belonged to her daughter before she got married and moved out to California. Dressed in these borrowed clothes, Elizabeth sat down at the kitchen table as Ethan fixed her a plate of food. He sounded almost apologetic when he placed it in front of her, saying, "It is not much, just some stew. Martha's a fine cook, but we keep our meals simple around here." "It smells absolutely wonderful," Elizabeth told him, the words making her realize just how famished she truly was. She lifted a spoonful to her lips and almost sighed out loud at the savory taste. "This is the most delicious thing I have ever eaten." A slight smile pulled at the edge of Ethan's mouth. "I find that hunger is always the best spice." While she ate, Elizabeth discreetly watched him. In the soft glow of the lamp, she noticed he had a rugged sort of handsomeness, with a face lined more by the sun and wind than by his years. His hands, though calloused and marked with the small scars of hard labor, handled the coffee pot with a surprising gentleness. There was an undeniable presence about him, a quiet kind of strength that seemed to command the entire room. Ethan sat down across from her with his own cup of coffee. "You mentioned you were on your way to be married. Will your fiancé be out there searching for you?" Elizabeth put her spoon down. "I honestly do not know. My father arranged my engagement to Harold before he passed away last winter. I have only met Harold on 2 occasions. He is the son of a banker in Denver." "And where did you come from before all this, Miss Prescott?" "I am from Boston. My father brought us west after my mother passed, hoping he could strike it rich in the mines. He provided for me well, but on the condition that I marry Harold to make sure my future was secure." Ethan's face gave nothing away. "And what about now?" Elizabeth looked down at her own hands, which were still raw and chafed from the chains. "Now I have no idea what I'm supposed to do. I do not have any family left, and I—" A sudden knock at the front door cut her off. "That will be Doc Peterson," Ethan said as he stood up. "Let's have him take a look at those injuries." Dr. Peterson was an older gentleman with gentle hands and kind eyes. He carefully checked Elizabeth's wrists and the other cuts and bruises she had gotten while she was held captive. "You are a very lucky young woman," he said as he applied a soothing salve to her wrists. "You have no broken bones, and these cuts will heal up nicely if you take care of them. What you really need now is plenty of rest and some good food." He looked over at Ethan. "She should not be traveling for at least a full week, possibly even longer." "She can stay here as long as she needs to," Ethan answered. "Martha can keep an eye on her." "I certainly can," Martha agreed. "The poor child needs a woman's care after everything she has endured." Once the doctor had gone, Elizabeth found she could barely keep her eyes open. The day's terrifying events, mixed with a warm meal in her belly, were making it impossible to fight off sleep. "You need to get some rest," Ethan said, seeing her struggle to stay awake. "You can have my room. I will sleep in the spare room with Jessie." "Oh, I could not possibly do that," Elizabeth started to object. "It is already decided," Martha cut in. "You need to rest in a real bed. Now come with me." Elizabeth was far too tired to put up a fight, so she let Martha guide her to Ethan's room. The space was simple, furnished with a solid wooden bed, a chest for clothes, and a small desk for writing. Through the window, she could see the corral where a few horses were grazing under the moonlight. "Sleep well, my dear," Martha said, lowering the lamp's wick. "You are safe here now." When the door clicked shut, Elizabeth collapsed onto the bed. The room smelled faintly of pine and leather, a scent she was already starting to connect with Ethan Keller. Even though her circumstances were strange, a surprising feeling of peace washed over her as she drifted off to sleep. Elizabeth woke up to the feeling of sunlight on her face and the faint sound of horses in the distance. For a second, she felt a jolt of fear, confused by the strange room. Then, all at once, the memories of the day before came flooding back. She was not in danger. She was safe. A cowboy named Ethan Keller had saved her. A gentle knock came from the door. "Miss Prescott, are you awake?" It was Martha's voice. "Yes, please, you can come in." Martha came in holding a stack of folded clothes. I brought you something you can wear. These belong to my daughter, but she left them here when she got married. They might be a little big on you, but they will work for now until we can figure out something better." Elizabeth gratefully took the plain cotton dress and the underthings. "You are so very kind, Mrs. Winters." "Please, just call me Martha," the older woman said with a smile. "And it is not kindness to help a person who is in trouble. It is just what any decent person would do." She helped Elizabeth get dressed, using a few pins to make the large clothes fit a little better. "Mr. Keller rode out to town early this morning. He is sending a telegram to the lawmen about those criminals, and another one to your fiancé to tell him you are safe." A knot formed in Elizabeth's stomach when she heard Harold's name. With all the turmoil of her rescue, she had barely given a thought to the man she was supposed to marry, or what he might be thinking. "There now," Martha said, stepping back to look at her work. "You look a whole lot better. Come on out and get some breakfast, and after that you can sit and rest on the porch if you would like. It is a lovely day." The kitchen felt warm and smelled like fresh coffee and bacon cooking on the stove. Jesse was already at the table, and he quickly stood up when Elizabeth walked in. "Good morning, Miss Prescott," he said, holding his hat in his hands. "You are looking much better today, if you do not mind me saying so." "Thank you, Jesse," Elizabeth said as she sat in the chair Martha pointed to. During breakfast, Jesse talked on and on about the ranch. He told her how Ethan had built it all from scratch after he came back from the war, how they raised some of the best horses in the whole territory, and how everyone knew Ethan was a fair man with a steady hand. "Mr. Keller is the best man a person could ever work for," Jesse said with real sincerity. "He took me in after my father passed, gave me a job and a roof over my head. Everything I know about being a rancher, he taught me." "He sounds like a very good man," Elizabeth said, surprised at how much she wanted to know about the man who had rescued her. Jesse nodded his head eagerly. "He is the best there is, though he mostly keeps to himself. I reckon he has been hurt one too many times." "Jesse, Cooper, that is more than enough gossip for one morning," Martha gently scolded him. "Miss Prescott does not need to hear all of Mr. Keller's personal business." After they finished eating, just as she had promised, Martha got Elizabeth settled on the porch with a warm quilt and a tall glass of lemonade. From where she sat, she had a good view of most of the ranch. She could see the corral where several fine horses were grazing, the big barn where Jesse was now working on his chores, and the wide open sky over the rolling hills that seemed to go on forever. It was a world away from Boston, with its crowded streets and strict social rules. Even Denver, where she had stayed for a short while with her father before he passed, felt confining compared to the vast freedom of this place. For the very first time, Elizabeth started to question if her father's plan had really been for her own good, or if it was just what he thought was best based on his limited view of the world. The sound of horse hooves approaching pulled her from her thoughts. Ethan came riding into view, his tall frame outlined by the bright morning sun. She felt a strange flutter inside her chest at the sight of him, a feeling that was both confusing and exciting. He swung down from his horse with ease, giving the animal a pat on the neck before handing the reins to Jesse, who had just come out of the barn. Their conversation was too far away for Elizabeth to make out the words, but she saw Jesse nod a few times before he led the horse away. When Ethan turned and saw her sitting on the porch, he took off his hat and walked toward the house. Elizabeth was once again struck by how his quiet confidence seemed to fill the air around him, even though he moved without any sort of swagger. "Miss Prescott," he said, as he came up the porch steps, "you are looking much better today." "That is all thanks to your kindness, Mr. Keller," she answered. "Martha told me you rode to town to send some telegrams." Ethan nodded and took the chair next to hers. "I let the sheriff know about Turner and his men. I also sent a message to Denver for a Mr. Harold Williamson. I figured that must be your fiancé." "Yes," Elizabeth said, feeling a peculiar emptiness in her voice. "What did you tell him?" "I just said that you were safe and recovering from your ordeal at my ranch, and that you would come back to Denver as soon as you were well, enough to make the trip." Ethan looked closely at her face. "I hope I did the right thing." Elizabeth gazed out at the mountains in the distance. "I suppose you did. It is what everyone expects." A quiet moment passed between them before Ethan spoke again. If you do not mind me saying, you do not seem all that excited about going back to your fiancé. I barely even know the man, Elizabeth confessed. We have probably spent a total of 3 hours together, and always with a chaperone. Our marriage was something my father wanted, not me. And what is it that you want, Miss Prescott? The question took her by surprise. Nobody had ever asked her that before. Not her father, not Harold, not any of the society women who had shown an interest in her future after her father passed away. I do not know, she said, and it was the honest truth. I have never really had the chance to think about it for myself. Ethan's blue eyes met hers for a long moment, and it felt like something unspoken passed between them. Maybe it was a flicker of recognition, like two similar souls acknowledging each other in a way she could not yet explain. Well, he finally said, you have plenty of time to consider it while you're healing up here. The doctor said you need at least a full week, remember? Elizabeth gave a little nod, feeling a strange sense of relief that she was still supposed to be healing. Thank you again for taking me in, Mr. Keller. Ethan, he said, correcting her with a faint smile. If you are going to be staying here under my roof, we may as well be on a first-name basis. Ethan, she said again, and she liked the way his name felt on her tongue. And please, you must call me Elizabeth. The days that came after that settled into a peaceful kind of rhythm. Elizabeth felt herself getting stronger with every passing day, thanks to Martha's good home cooking and the clean country air. She would spend her mornings out on the porch, sometimes with a book from Ethan's small library. Other times she just sat and watched the daily life of the ranch happen all around her. In the afternoons, when the summer sun was at its hottest, she would go inside to rest. As she got her strength back, Martha started giving her little jobs to do, like shelling peas, kneading bread, or mending clothes. Elizabeth was surprised to find that she liked the kitchen work, especially doing it in Martha's warm kitchen with its pretty view of the mountains. In the evenings after supper, the three of them would usually sit together on the porch while the air began to cool down. Jesse would sometimes pull out his harmonica, and the sad, sweet songs would float out into the twilight. Martha would sit and knit by the light of a lamp while Ethan smoked his pipe, and the sweet smell of his tobacco filled the evening air. It was during those quiet nights that Elizabeth started to learn more about the man who had saved her. Ethan did not talk much about himself, but from the stories Jesse told and things Martha let slip, she pieced together a picture of him. He was a man who had fought for the Union, came back home to Missouri to find his family's farm gone, and then came out west to start all over. He had built this whole ranch himself, starting with nothing but a couple of horses and a dream. Those horses saved him, Martha told Elizabeth one afternoon while they were hanging laundry. After the war, he was a different man, had a darkness in him, you could say. But working with those animals, well, that seemed to heal something inside him. Elizabeth looked over toward the corral where Ethan was working with a young bay stallion. There was something captivating about watching him with the horses, the way he moved so slow and steady, his voice a low rumble that could soothe even the most high-strung horse. He has a real gift, she said quietly. Martha nodded. He sure does. That man understands those creatures better than most people understand each other. On the fourth day she was there, a reply came to the telegram Ethan had sent. Harold Williamson wrote that he was relieved she was safe and that he would come to get her as soon as he could get away from his business, which would probably be in about 2 weeks. Elizabeth read the short message over twice, looking for some sign of real feeling, maybe some concern for what she had been through, or happiness that she was alive, maybe even a word of love. But the words were just cold and all business. She folded the paper up and put it in her pocket, not sure why she felt so let down when she never expected that kind of affection from Harold anyway. That evening, she found Ethan out on the porch by himself. Jesse had gone into town to see some friends, and Martha had already gone to bed. He was leaning on the railing, just looking up at the stars, which were burning brighter than Elizabeth had ever seen them back in the city. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, her voice soft. Ethan turned, and the hard look on his face softened when he saw her. Of course not. They stood there for a while in a comfortable silence, with the cool night air all around them. The only things you could hear were a coyote howling off in the distance, and the gentle sounds of the horses in the barn. "I got a reply from Harold today," Elizabeth finally said. "He says he'll be here to get me in about 2 weeks." Ethan just nodded, his face looking strong in the moonlight. "That is good news." "Yes," she agreed, but a strange heaviness settled in her chest. "I should be all healed up by then. And you will go back to Denver, marry that banker, and live the life your father set up for you." He was not judging her, just saying it like it was a fact. Elizabeth looked down at her hands, where the marks from the chains were already starting to fade. "It is what everyone expects." "Is it what you want?" There was that question again, the one that felt like it could see right through her. Elizabeth found she could not give him the easy, polite answers she used to give. "I do not know what I want anymore," she admitted quietly. Before what happened, I never questioned the future that was laid out for me. It made sense. It was safe. But now... Now? Ethan prompted her when she trailed off. "Now I am starting to wonder if there is more to life than just being sensible and safe." Elizabeth turned to look right at him. "These last few days, watching you and Jesse with the horses, and seeing the home Martha makes here, feeling the beauty and the freedom of this place, it has stirred something up inside of me that I did not even know was there." Ethan's eyes locked with hers, and Elizabeth felt her breath catch at the look in his eyes. "Freedom costs something," he said in a low voice. "It means you have to make your own choices and your own mistakes. It means you are responsible for your own happiness." "Is that what you did when you came out west?" A shadow passed over his face. "Partly. I also came to get away after the war. There were some ghosts I could not shake back in Missouri." Elizabeth found herself reaching out and putting her hand over his on the porch railing. His hand felt warm and rough under hers. "And did you get away from them?" Ethan looked down at their hands together, then back up at her face. "Some of them followed me. But I found a kind of peace here that I could not find anywhere else." The air between them grew thick with something she could not put a name to, but she could feel it down to her bones. For a heartbeat, she thought he was going to kiss her. And the strangest part was, she hoped he would. But instead, he gently pulled his hand out from under hers. "It is getting late. You should get some rest." She was disappointed, but she understood why he was being a gentleman, so she just nodded. "Good night, Ethan." "Good night, Elizabeth." As she laid in her bed that night, sleep just would not come. Her mind was full of thoughts about Ethan Keller, about his quiet strength, his gentle hands, and the way his eyes crinkled up when he smiled. She had known the man for less than a week, but somehow he had made a home in her heart in a way no one, not even her own father, ever had. Could this be what falling in love felt like? It was not the sensible, settled feeling she had about her engagement to Harold, but this crazy, shaky feeling that was a mix of wanting and happiness, and being scared all at once. And if it was love, what on earth was she supposed to do about it? In less than 2 weeks, Harold would come for her, and she would go back to the life that was planned out for her. That thought used to make her feel secure, but now it felt more like a prison sentence. The next morning was clear and bright, with a little bit of fall in the air. Elizabeth woke up early. She had hardly slept a wink with all that on her mind. She got dressed in the borrowed clothes that were starting to feel like they were hers, and headed for the kitchen. She was surprised to see Ethan was already in there, pouring himself some coffee in a tin cup. He looked up when she walked in, and the warmth in his gaze made her heart do a little flip. "You are up early," he said, grabbing another cup for her. "Coffee?" "Yes, please." She took the hot cup from him, and their fingers touched for just a second. "I could not sleep." Ethan leaned back against the counter, looking at her over the top of his cup. Bad dreams about what happened? No, not that. Elizabeth paused, then figured she might as well be honest. I was thinking about going back to Denver, back to Harold. Having second thoughts? I do not know that I ever had first thoughts about it, she admitted. The whole engagement was my father's idea. I just went along with it. Ethan put his cup down on the counter. Elizabeth, whatever you decide to do with your future, it has to be your choice. Not your father's, not Harold's, and not anyone else's. Even if my choice disappoints everyone? Even then, he said, his voice gentle but strong. Life is too short to live it, trying to please everybody else. She felt something click inside her when he said that, like a key had turned in a lock she did not even know was there. But before she could say anything, Jesse came bursting into the kitchen, his young face all lit up. Mr. Keller, the black mare's foalin', and I think she is in trouble. Ethan was on his feet in an instant. How far along is she? Her water broke about an hour ago, but she's pushing hard and nothing's happening. I will be right there. Ethan turned to Elizabeth. I am sorry, I have to go, she told him. I understand. He gave her a quick nod of thanks and followed Jesse out the door, leaving Elizabeth by herself with her thoughts and her coffee, which was now getting cold. Later that morning, after she helped Martha with the breakfast dishes, Elizabeth made her way out to the barn. She had never been around horses much in her city life, but something about the animals drew her in, and she wanted to understand them better. The cool darkness of the barn was a relief from the bright sun, and the air smelled rich with hay and horse. She followed the sounds of voices to a big stall at the end of the barn, where she saw Ethan and Jesse kneeling next to a beautiful black mare. The horse was lying on her side, and her sides were pumping with each push. Is she going to be okay? Elizabeth asked in a quiet voice. Both of them looked up, surprised to see her there. Ethan had his sleeves rolled up, and his arms were covered in some kind of grease. The foal's not lined up right, he explained. I have to get it turned before she can push it out. Elizabeth stepped a little closer, fascinated even though she was a little scared. Can I do anything to help? Ethan looked at her for a second, then nodded his head. You can talk to her, keep her calm. Horses like a gentle voice. She gathered her skirts and knelt down by the mare's head, gently stroking the mare's damp neck. What is her name? Midnight, Jesse said. She's the best cutting horse on this whole ranch. Elizabeth moved in close to the mare's ear, whispering softly. Hello, Midnight, she murmured. You are doing a wonderful job. Your baby is almost here. As she kept her voice calm and soothing, Ethan worked with a quiet focus. His strong hands were surprisingly gentle as they helped guide the unborn foal into the proper birthing position. Elizabeth found her gaze fixed on his face. She watched the deep concentration in his eyes, the firm set of his jaw, and listened to the occasional soft words of encouragement he offered the laboring horse. Then, with a mighty push from the mare, Ethan sat back on his heels. There now, he said. The head's in position. She can handle the rest on her own. In the moments that followed, the miracle of new life played out right before Elizabeth's eyes. The foal entered the world in a sudden rush, its long, spindly legs folded against its body. It was dark, wet, and utterly perfect. It is a colt, Ethan announced, a wide smile spreading across his face. And a handsome one, too. Midnight turned her head, nickering softly as she looked at her new baby. The colt, still slick and new, began to struggle, already trying to lift its head, driven by the powerful instinct to get to its feet. He is beautiful, Elizabeth breathed, completely captivated by the amazing sight. Ethan glanced up at her, and his face was lit by a smile she had never seen before. It was open, joyful, and had a boyish delight to it. Yes, he certainly is. Their eyes met and held for a long, quiet moment, an unspoken connection passing between them. Jesse shattered the peaceful spell with an excited shout. Just wait until the folks in town hear about this one. Ethan chuckled, turning his gaze back to the mare and her new colt. Midnight's colts always bring in a good price. Let's give them a little time together before we start counting our dollars, Jesse. They remained in the stall for another hour, watching the wobbly-legged colt finally find his footing. Then, with a comical sense of purpose, he began searching for his first meal. Elizabeth was fascinated by the deep, natural bond between the mare and her colt, and the pure trust and love that was clear in every single movement. By the time they finally left the barn, the sun was already high in the sky. Elizabeth was surprised when she looked down and saw her dress was stained with dirt and bits of straw, and her hair had tumbled from its pins, falling around her shoulders. Back in Boston, she would have been horrified by such a mess. But out here, it felt completely natural, like a badge of honor from the morning's incredible experience. "Thank you for letting me be a part of that," she said to Ethan as they walked toward the house. "You were a real help," he answered. "Midnight took a liking to you. She can be mighty particular about strangers." "I have never really been around horses before," Elizabeth confessed. "In Boston, they were just for transportation. I never considered them as individuals." "Oh, every one of them has its own personality, its own spirit," Ethan explained. "Just like people, once you take the time to know them." They had arrived at the porch, but neither of them made a move to go inside. Instead, they stood together in the gentle shade of a large oak tree next to the steps. "I have been thinking," Elizabeth began, working up her courage, "about what you said earlier this morning, about me making my own choices." Ethan remained quiet, giving her the space she needed to continue. "I do not think I want to marry Harold," she admitted in a soft voice. "If I am being honest with myself, I have never been sure. I just did not believe I had any other choice. My father's will put everything in a trust until I was married, and he named Harold's father as the one in charge. So if you do not marry him, you get nothing." Ethan's brow furrowed. "Not until I turn 25, and that is 3 years from now," Elizabeth sighed. "My father thought he was protecting me from men who might only want my money. And instead, he made you completely dependent on the husband he chose for you," Ethan said, shaking his head. "Forgive me for speaking poorly of your father, but that seems like a terribly cruel restriction to put on your life." "He meant well," Elizabeth said, though her voice lacked real conviction. "He just wanted me to be secure." "There are different ways to be secure," Ethan pointed out. "Financial security does not mean much if you feel trapped and unhappy in your own home." His words resonated deep inside her. "No," she agreed quietly. "It really does not." The sound of approaching hoofbeats caught their attention. A rider was heading their way, and even from far off, Elizabeth could tell it was not Jesse. Ethan grew tense beside her, his hand automatically reaching for the spot where he normally wore his gun, although it was not there now. "Stay right here," he said, moving down the steps to meet the visitor. Elizabeth watched with a growing sense of worry as the rider came closer. He was a stranger, a middle-aged man with a thick mustache and the weary, dusty appearance of someone who had spent a long time on the trail. "Keller," the man called out as he pulled his horse to a stop. "I have news that you need to hear." "Ben," Ethan greeted him. "What brings you all the way out here?" "It is Silas Turner," the man said, his voice grim. "The word is he has put together a new gang. They say he is looking for you, and for the lady you took from him." Elizabeth felt all the color drain from her face. She could still hear the outlaw's final threat ringing in her ears. "This is not over." Ethan's expression grew hard as stone. "The sheriff caught one of Turner's new men in town yesterday. He was drunk and talking too much. Said Turner was planning to make a move soon. I figured you should know." "I appreciate the warning, Ben. You will stay for a meal, won't you?" The man shook his head. "I need to get back. The wife is expecting me." He tipped his hat toward Elizabeth. "Ma'am." As Ben rode off, Ethan turned back to Elizabeth, his face serious. "We need to get inside." Once they were in the kitchen, Ethan explained everything to Martha, who immediately started worrying about securing the doors and windows. "I will send Jesse back to town as soon as he returns," Ethan decided. "We have to let the sheriff know that Turner might be close." "This is all my fault," Elizabeth said, her voice filled with distress. "I have brought this danger to your home." "No," Ethan stated firmly. "This is Silas Turner's fault, not yours. You are not to blame for what he does." Elizabeth was not so sure. "But if I had not been here, then you would likely be dead or something far worse," Martha cut in sharply. "And that is the end of that kind of talk. What is done is done. Now, we prepare." The rest of the afternoon was a whirlwind of activity. Jesse came home and was immediately sent off to town again with a message for the sheriff. Martha took an inventory of their food supplies while Ethan carefully checked and cleaned his guns, laying them out on the kitchen table with calm precision. Elizabeth, determined to be useful, asked what she could do to help. Ethan paused for a moment, then picked up a Winchester rifle that was leaning against the wall. "Do you know how to shoot?" Elizabeth shook her head. "I have never even held a gun before." "Well then," he said, "it is about time you learned how to use this," he said, placing the rifle in her hands. "If Turner and his bunch decide to show their faces, you need to be ready to defend what is yours." The heft of the steel was foreign to her, a cold mix of fear and newfound strength. Ethan walked her through the steps. How to feed a cartridge into the chamber, how to sight down the barrel, and the most vital rule of all, never let it face anything you are not fixing to destroy. "We will get some practice in come morning," he vowed. "For tonight, just get the feel of it." Sleep was a stranger to that ranch house that evening. Ethan was determined to stand the first watch, settling onto the porch, his shotgun resting on his lap. Elizabeth, with no hope of rest, came out to join him after the moon was high, a shawl pulled tight around her against the chill of the Texas night. "You ought to be inside asleep," he murmured as she took a seat next to him. "I am not able to," she confessed. "Every single time my eyes shut, I see Silas Turner's hateful face." Ethan's jaw clenched hard. "He will not get the chance to lay a hand on you again." "It is not only my own safety I'm thinking of," Elizabeth whispered. "You, Martha, Jesse, all of y'all are in harm's way, because I am here." "We have seen tougher times than this," Ethan told her, trying to sound convincing. But the tight set of his shoulders told a different story. For a long moment they just sat there, surrounded by the vast, quiet dark of the open range. At last Elizabeth broke the silence. "If anything were to happen to me—" "Nothing is going to happen to you," Ethan cut in, his voice full of iron. "But if it did," she went on, determined, "I need you to understand that my time here on your ranch, it has been the only time in my life I have ever felt truly free. I would not trade a single second of it, not even with the trouble it has brought." He turned his head to face her, the endless stars of the night sky mirrored in his eyes. "Elizabeth," he started to say, but his words were swallowed by the crack of a rifle shot echoing from far off, followed by the drumming of hooves getting closer. "Get inside now," Ethan commanded. He was already moving as they rushed back into the house, with Ethan throwing the heavy bolt on the door. Martha and Jesse were up, the gunshot having pulled them from their beds. "Riders coming from the north," Ethan announced, spinning the cylinder of his pistol. "Jesse, you get to the back window. Martha, head upstairs. Elizabeth, you stay in the middle of the room, far from any glass." "I can be of use," Elizabeth insisted, lifting the rifle she had just been handed. For a second, Ethan paused. Then he gave a sharp nod. "Keep your head down and do not fire unless you have no other choice." The moments that followed were a chaotic swirl of dread and adrenaline. The sound of gunshots grew louder, closer. Elizabeth peered through a gap in the curtains and saw dark shapes slipping through the night, using the shadows to creep toward the house. I count at least 6, Jesse yelled from his post. Could be more. Nobody fires until they are right on top of us, Ethan commanded. We have to make each bullet count. The raiders made it to the edge of the yard, ducking behind the water trough and an old buckboard. A hateful voice, Silas Turner's, sliced through the air. Keller, we know y'all are in there. Send that girl out, and we might just let the rest of you see the sunrise. You can go straight to hell, Turner, Ethan roared in reply. A storm of bullets was the answer, lead smacking hard into the thick wooden planks of the house. Ethan fired back through a crack in the window frame, and a man screamed somewhere in the dark. That is one, Ethan said, his voice cold as stone. The firefight raged on, a deadly trade of lead. Martha, showing a surprising amount of grit for her years, let loose with the shotgun from the second floor, making 2 of the attackers scramble for cover as they tried to rush the front porch. A strange, unnatural quiet fell, and in that quiet, a soft crackling sound started to grow. Fire! Jesse shouted from the rear of the house. They are trying to smoke us out like rats! Elizabeth caught the foul smell of smoke just before she saw it, a bitter warning that seeped in through the walls. Peeking outside, she saw the orange tongues of flame starting to chew on the corner of the barn. They have set the barn on fire, she cried out, her first thought on midnight and the new foal. Ethan's face became a hard mask of pure rage and resolve. Jesse, Martha, lay down some covering fire for me. I am going in to get those horses. Ethan, you cannot, Elizabeth pleaded, her hand gripping his arm. It is far too dangerous. His gaze locked with hers, unwavering. I will not let them cook in there. Before she could argue anymore, he had vanished out the back, a shadow moving quickly toward the blazing barn, hidden by the thick smoke. Elizabeth stood frozen at the window, her heart pounding against her ribs as she watched Ethan run into the inferno. Martha laid down a constant barrage of shots, keeping the attackers from drawing a bead on him. Jesse did the same from his position. The minutes stretched on, feeling like hours. The fire roared, painting the dark night with a hellish orange light. Elizabeth sent a desperate prayer to heaven, a prayer for Ethan, for all of them. And then, like an answer, the horses began to pour out of the burning barn. First came Midnight with her little foal, then the others, their eyes wide with terror as they galloped past the fire and into the dark safety of the pasture. But Ethan was not with them. Just as despair began to take hold of her, a man stumbled out of the barn, hacking and covered in black soot, but breathing. Ethan was alive. That son of a gun made it out, she heard one of the attackers yell. Somebody shoot him. Without a second thought, Elizabeth brought the rifle to her shoulder and fired toward the sound of that voice. She could not tell if her bullet found its mark, but it was enough. The attackers dropped down for cover, and that gave Ethan the moment he needed to run for the house. He crashed back through the door, fighting for every breath, his face a mess of black soot. Every horse is safe, he choked out between coughs. A wave of relief washed over Elizabeth, but there was no time to celebrate. The assault on the house grew even more fierce, with bullets blowing out the windows and tearing splinters from the walls. They are trying to pin us in here while the house catches, Ethan said, his voice grim. We have to make a move now, or we are going to be cooked alive. As if to prove his point, the smell of smoke thickened in the air. Elizabeth glanced through a shattered window and saw that the fire had already caught the edge of the porch. What is our plan? She asked, her voice trembling just a little. Ethan looked right at her, and in that one look a whole conversation happened without a single word. It was a promise that if this was their end, they would face it on their feet and fighting. We are running for it, he declared. The buckboard is still out behind the house. If we can get to it, we might just have a chance. What about the horses? Jesse called out. They are probably halfway to the next county by now, Ethan answered. We have to leave them behind. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only one they had. Martha and Jesse would lay down fire to cover Ethan and Elizabeth's run to the wagon. Then Ethan would return the favor for them. "Are you ready?" Ethan asked, his hand resting on the latch of the back door. Elizabeth gave a firm nod, her knuckles white on the stock of her rifle. "Ready. On the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. They flew out the door, bent low and running as fast as they could toward the wagon sitting about 20 yards away. The air exploded with gunfire and dirt kicked up all around their feet. Elizabeth felt like her heart was going to hammer its way right out of her body. They made it to the wagon, and Ethan shoved her up onto the driver's bench, then climbed up after her. Back in the house, Martha and Jesse kept up the steady shooting, forcing the raiders to keep their heads low. "Now!" Ethan yelled. Martha and Jesse broke from the house, with Jesse helping the old woman along. They were almost to the safety of the wagon when one shot found its mark. Jesse went down, crying out as he fell. "Jesse!" Martha shrieked. Ethan was already off the wagon and running toward them, his pistol barking in the night. Elizabeth did not even think. She just stood up on the bench and started firing her own rifle, trying to give Ethan some cover. He got to Jesse and Martha, hauling the injured boy upright. Together, the three of them stumbled the last few feet to the wagon as bullets sang past their ears. With one last great heave, Ethan managed to get Jesse into the back of the wagon before helping Martha climb in. "Drive!" Ethan shouted at Elizabeth, jumping onto the bench next to her. Elizabeth had never handled a team of horses in her life, but this was no time to learn. She snapped the leather reins hard over the animals' backs. The wagon jolted forward, pulling them away from the burning ranch and into the deep darkness of the night. Silas Turner and his men kept shooting, but the wagon was moving fast, and soon the sound of their guns faded behind them. Elizabeth urged the horses on, keeping them at a dead run, following a dusty track that she hoped led to town. Beside her, Ethan scanned the darkness behind them for any sign of pursuit, his pistol held tight in his hand. In the wagon bed, Martha was already tending to Jesse's arm. The bullet had gone clean through his shoulder. It was a bad wound, but it would not kill him. "What is our next move?" Elizabeth asked, her voice unsteady from the pure terror of the last hour. "We ride for town," Ethan answered, his face set like granite. "If Jesse's message got there, the sheriff should have a posse ready to ride." He looked over at her, his features lit by the pale moonlight. "And then," he said, "we are going to end this for good." They rode on through the long night, the sight of their burning home fading behind them like a bad nightmare. Elizabeth's hands were rubbed raw from the reins, and her whole body ached from being so tense. But she did not slow the horses down, taking courage from the steady presence of Ethan next to her. When the first light of dawn painted the sky, they topped a rise and saw the little town of Pine Creek laid out below. Ethan gently took the reins from her shaking hands and guided the weary team down the main road toward the sheriff's building. News of their arrival traveled like wildfire. By the time they pulled up, a small crowd was already there, staring at the smoke-stained survivors and the injured boy in the wagon. Sheriff Davis, a tall fellow with salt and pepper hair and a face carved by the sun, stepped out of his office holding a rifle. "Keller," he said, his voice a low rumble. "What in the devil happened out there?" "It was Silas Turner and his crew," Ethan said as he helped Elizabeth down. "They set fire to my ranch and tried to murder every last one of us." The sheriff's face grew hard as rock. "Turner again. I have had enough of that man. A posse searching for him ever since Jesse delivered your message yesterday. We have to find him before he hurts anyone else," Ethan said, his voice strained with a tightly controlled anger. "And Jesse needs a doctor." The town doctor was called, and Jesse was carefully moved to his office to be treated. Martha, who was exhausted but safe, was taken in by the minister's wife. Ethan and Elizabeth soon found themselves in the sheriff's office, recounting their story to the serious-faced lawman. "Turner has been a thorn in my side for years," Sheriff Davis said after they finished. "But this, burning out honest people, kidnapping women, this is too far, even for a man like him." "Will you go after him?" Elizabeth asked. "I already am," the sheriff promised her. "I have got 6 men out there right now, and I will send more. But this is a big territory, and Turner knows it like the back of his hand." I want to join the posse, Ethan declared, his tone leaving no room for discussion. Sheriff Davis looked at him for a long moment, then gave a firm nod. I figured you would. We will head out at noon. That will give the horses a rest and let us get fresh supplies. I am coming with you, Elizabeth announced. Both men turned to stare at her in surprise. Absolutely not, Ethan stated, his voice firm. That's just too dangerous. I have already faced the danger, Elizabeth shot back. This is my fight just as much as it is yours. Turner took me, and he chained me to his wagon like some kind of animal. I have every right to see justice served. The sheriff shifted his weight and cleared his throat. Ma'am, I surely do admire your grit, but a posse is no place for a lady. A woman, Elizabeth finished for him, her chin held high in defiance. I just helped defend a ranch from an attack and drove a wagon through the dark to get us to safety. I know how to ride. I know how to shoot. Ethan taught me. And I know Turner's face better than most of the men you have riding with you probably do. Ethan looked at her with a mix of pride and deep worry. Elizabeth, if something were to happen to you. It already did, she said, her voice softening. And I made it through because of you. Now you have to let me help finish this. After a long and heated discussion, they finally settled on a compromise. Elizabeth would ride with the posse to their base camp. She would stay there with a few deputies while the main group went after Turner in the rougher country. As they were all getting ready to leave, a message arrived that Harold Williamson was in town. He had gotten Ethan's telegram telling him Elizabeth had been rescued. A heavy feeling settled in Elizabeth's stomach when she heard the news. After everything she had been through, her fiancé and the life she once knew felt like they belonged to a different person entirely. Harold was at the hotel, pacing back and forth in the small lobby, when Elizabeth walked in. He was just how she remembered him, tall and thin, with his brown hair neatly combed and a pair of wire-rimmed glasses. His suit was expensive and fit him perfectly, though it was a little wrinkled from his travels. "Elizabeth," he cried out when he saw her. "Thank heavens you are safe. When I got the news about the kidnapping, I was imagining the very worst." He started to move toward her for an embrace, but then stopped short, as if he was just now seeing how she looked. She was wearing borrowed men's clothes for practical reasons. Her face was still smudged with dirt and ash, and a rifle was slung over her shoulder. "What in the world are you wearing?" he asked, his relief quickly turning into bewilderment. Elizabeth felt a strange sense of distance, like she was watching the whole scene from far away. This man was supposed to be her husband, but she felt no connection to him whatsoever. "Hello, Harold," she said in a quiet voice. "I am glad to see you are all right." "All right. I've been worried sick, and now I find you dressed up like some kind of frontierswoman, and you are carrying a firearm, no less." His voice was filled with genuine alarm. "What has happened to you?" Just before Elizabeth could give him an answer, Ethan stepped into the hotel lobby. Harold turned and looked at the tall cowboy, taking in his trail-worn clothes, the gun belt at his hip, and the careful watch in his eyes. "Mr. Williamson," Ethan said with a simple nod. "I am Ethan Keller. I am the rancher who sent you the telegram," Harold acknowledged. "I suppose I owe you my thanks for saving my fiancée." "It was just the right thing to do," Ethan answered plainly. An uncomfortable silence filled the room. The three of them were frozen in a moment that perfectly showed the choice Elizabeth was now facing. The safe, planned-out life with Harold, or the unknown, risky but real life she had caught a glimpse of with Ethan. "Mr. Keller is joining the posse to catch the men who took me," Elizabeth explained to Harold. "And I am going with them." "What?" Harold looked completely stunned. "That is utterly absurd. You are coming back to Denver with me, where you will be safe." "I cannot," Elizabeth said, and she was surprised at how steady her own voice sounded. "Not right now. Not until this is all over." "Elizabeth, be sensible," Harold pleaded with her. "You have been through a horrible experience. You are not thinking straight." "Actually," she replied, "I am thinking more clearly than I ever have before in my entire life." She could tell that Harold was truly worried about her in his own way. But his worry was about possession and what he expected of her, not about understanding who she really was or what she needed. "The posse is leaving in 1 hour," Ethan said, breaking the strained silence. "I will wait for you outside. Give you two some time alone." When he walked out, Elizabeth felt a sharp ache of longing that was so strong it almost stole her breath. In that single moment, she knew for certain that her heart had already chosen, even if her mind hadn't quite caught up yet. "Harold," she said softly, turning back to face her fiancé. "I have to do this. After it is done, we can talk about our future." Harold pushed his glasses up, looking completely lost. "I do not understand any of this, Elizabeth. This is not like you at all." "Maybe it is," she suggested. "Maybe this is the person I have always been, but I just never had a chance to find out." In the end, Harold grudgingly agreed to stay in town and wait for her to come back. But his disapproval was clear in the stiff way he stood as he watched her ride off with the posse an hour later. The posse, made up of 12 men, including Ethan and the sheriff, left Pine Creek just after noon. Elizabeth rode a borrowed mare next to Ethan, feeling the curious and sometimes disapproving looks from some of the other riders. But the sheriff had spoken for her, and not a single man was brave enough to question his decision. They followed the tracks north, heading toward the rugged hills where it was believed Silas Turner was holed up. When night fell, they got to a small valley where the sheriff decided they would set up camp. Just as they had planned, Elizabeth was to stay there with 2 deputies while the rest of them pushed on when the sun came up. As they all sat around the campfire that evening, Elizabeth found herself watching Ethan through the dancing flames. He was talking seriously with the sheriff, their heads leaning in together over a rough sketch of the land. The firelight carved shadows and light across his face, showing the strength of his jaw and the resolve in his eyes. After the other men had rolled out their bedrolls for the night, Ethan came over to Elizabeth, who was sitting a little away from the main camp, just looking up at the endless blanket of stars. "You ought to get some sleep," he said, sitting down next to her on a fallen tree. "I am not sure I can," she confessed. "Every time I shut my eyes, I see the ranch on fire. I hear the sound of the guns." Ethan nodded, showing he understood. "Those memories start to fade after a while. Not all the way, but just enough so they are not haunting you every minute you are awake." "Is that what it was like for you after the war?" "Yes," he said, "though it took a good bit longer than I would have liked." Elizabeth pulled her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them. "I am scared," she admitted. "Not of Turner and his men, but of what comes next, of the choice I have to make." "Between Denver and Pine Creek?" Ethan asked in a low voice. "Between Harold and—" He let the sentence hang, leaving the other choice unsaid. "Yes." Ethan was quiet for a long time before he spoke again. "Elizabeth, I do not have a thing to offer you. My ranch is gone. Everything I spent the last 7 years building is just a pile of ashes now. Do you really think that matters to me?" "It ought to," he said with a serious tone. "You are used to a comfortable life, to being secure. I cannot give you that, not right now, and maybe not ever." Elizabeth turned and faced him completely, the moonlight making her features glow like silver. "When I was chained up in that wagon, I would have given anything in the world for comfort and security. But now I know there are things that are much more important. Things like truth and freedom and courage." She took a slow, deep breath. "And love." The word hung there in the air between them, feeling both delicate and incredibly strong. "Elizabeth," Ethan started to say, but she put her fingers softly on his lips to stop him. "Do not tell me what I should want, or what is best for me," she said gently. "My whole life, other people have decided what I should do. My father's society, even Harold. For just this once, I want to be the one to choose." Ethan took her hand in his, and his calloused fingers felt warm against her skin. And what is it that you choose? Elizabeth's heart was hammering in her chest as she leaned in toward him. This, she whispered, and she pressed her lips against his. The kiss was soft at first. The kiss grew more intense when Ethan drew her in, his arms wrapping firmly around her waist. Elizabeth felt a powerful heat surge through her, a warmth born not from fear but from the man who held her like she was the most precious soul on earth. When they finally parted for air, both of them were breathless. Ethan touched his forehead to hers. "I have wanted to do that from the very first moment I laid eyes on you," he confessed. "Even when I was caked in dirt and half gone, chained up in that wagon," Elizabeth gently teased. "Even then," he confirmed, his voice low and raspy, "there was something in your eyes, a fire that all the hurt and fear could not put out." They remained there under the vast, starry sky for a long while, speaking quietly about their pasts, their worries, and the fragile hopes they held for what was to come. When Elizabeth finally settled into her bedroll, her heart felt lighter and more whole than it had in many long years. Morning arrived far too quickly, with gray light creeping over the eastern horizon as the posse got ready to ride out. Elizabeth stood with Ethan, a small distance away from the others, not wanting to say goodbye, even for a little while. "Be careful," she pleaded, her nervous fingers fussing with the collar of his coat. "I always am," he answered with a faint smile. "And you need to stay near Deputy Wilson and Hargrove. They are good men. They will see to your safety until we get back." "How long do you think you will be gone?" "It is hard to say. A couple of days, maybe 3 at the most, if we find Turner's trail soon." Elizabeth nodded, doing her best to conceal her worry. "I will be here waiting." Ethan took a quick look around, making sure no one was watching too closely, then leaned down and gave her a swift kiss. "That is a promise worth riding back for," he whispered against her lips. And just like that, he was gone. He swung onto his horse and rode off with the sheriff and the rest of the posse, leaving Elizabeth to watch them until they vanished over the crest of the hill. The 2 days that followed felt like the longest in Elizabeth's entire life. She kept busy around the camp, preparing meals for herself and the deputies, and tried with all her might not to imagine all the terrible things that could happen in the rugged wilderness where Ethan and the others were hunting for Celis Turner. On the morning of the 3rd day, as Elizabeth was gathering water from a stream close by, she heard the sound of a horse approaching the camp. Her heart jumped with anticipation, but it sank just as fast when she saw the rider. It was not Ethan or anyone from the posse, but Harold Williamson. "Elizabeth," Harold called out, swinging down from his horse with surprising grace. "Thank goodness I have found you." "Harold," she said, her voice full of confusion, "what on earth are you doing out here?" "I have come to take you home, naturally," he answered, as though it was the most obvious thing in the world. "This entire situation has gone on long enough." The deputies, hearing Harold's arrival, walked over with their hands resting near their pistols. "Is everything all right, Miss Prescott?" Deputy Wilson asked, his eyes on Harold. "Yes, I thank you," Elizabeth told him. "This is Mr. Williamson, my fiancé from Denver." Harold pulled his jacket straight, clearly uneasy around the armed men, but trying his best to hide it. "I am here to escort Miss Prescott back to civilization, gentlemen. Her difficult experience is over." "Begging your pardon, sir," Wilson said plainly, "but the lady is under our protection until the sheriff gets back. Those were his orders." "This is completely ridiculous," Harold sputtered. "Elizabeth, get your belongings. We are leaving now." A flare of anger shot through Elizabeth at his demanding tone. "No, Harold, I already told you that I am staying right here until this is over. And I am telling you that this whole frontier justice business is no concern of yours." Harold's voice climbed with frustration. "You have been charmed by this place, by these cowboys and their rough ways." "These men are putting their lives on the line to capture a dangerous man," Elizabeth shot back. "A man who took me, who was going to sell me like livestock if Mr. Keller had not saved me." "Ah, yes, your cowboy hero," Harold sneered. "The gossips in town have told me all about him." "Tell me, Elizabeth, is he the real reason you are so set on staying in this godforsaken country?" Before Elizabeth had a chance to answer, the distant crack of gunfire rolled through the valley. Everyone froze. They listened as several more shots followed, one after another. "That sound is coming from the north, Deputy," Hargrove said with a grim look. "The same direction the posse went." "You two stay put," Wilson ordered Elizabeth and Harold. "Hargrove, you are with me. We will go check it out." "I am going with you," Elizabeth declared, already striding toward her horse. "Elizabeth," Harold protested. "This is absolute madness." But she was already swinging into the saddle, her heart hammering with fear for Ethan. "You can stay here if you wish, Harold. I'm going." The deputies looked at each other, then gave a reluctant nod. "Stay right behind us," Wilson commanded. "And if there is any real sign of trouble, you turn around and ride back here fast. Do you understand?" Elizabeth nodded, ignoring Harold's ongoing complaints as the three of them spurred their horses toward the sound of the shooting, leaving him standing all alone in the camp. They rode hard for nearly 15 minutes, chasing the echoes of the guns that grew louder as they neared a rocky ridge. When they rounded a curve in the trail, they stumbled upon a scene of pure chaos. The posse was in a desperate firefight with Turner's gang, who were dug in among the rocks on the high ground. Elizabeth's eyes darted across the fight, searching for Ethan. She finally saw him using a large boulder for cover, trading shots with a gunman hidden above. "Get down!" Deputy Wilson yelled as bullets zipped right past them. They quickly dismounted and led their horses into the safety of some pine trees. The deputies jumped right into the battle, their rifles adding to the posse's firepower. Elizabeth, with her heart caught in her throat, crouched low behind a fallen log and watched the fight unfold. The sheriff's men were slowly making their way up the rocky slope, pushing Turner's gang deeper into their hideout. But the outlaws held the high ground and had plenty of cover. Then, all of a sudden, she noticed something moving off to her right. A man in a dusty black coat was sneaking around the side of the posse. It was Silas Turner himself. His scarred face was clear even from far away. He was getting into position to take a clean shot at the sheriff, who was out in the open directing his men. Without a second thought, Elizabeth brought her rifle up. Turner was a good 100 yards out, a very hard shot for even a seasoned shooter. She recalled Ethan's words: "Breathe slow, aim small, squeeze the trigger, do not pull it." She fired. The shot missed Turner, but hit the rock right next to him, spraying stone fragments into his face. He recoiled and ducked back behind cover, his ambush ruined. The sound of her rifle had alerted the posse to the new threat. The sheriff and a few of his men immediately focused their fire on Turner's location, forcing the outlaw chief to fall back. The gun battle raged on, with bullets flying everywhere. Elizabeth kept her head down, knowing her warning shot was lucky, and that she should not expose herself again. It was then that she heard a familiar voice cry out in pain. It was Ethan. Peeking carefully from behind the tree, she saw him grabbing his shoulder, with blood soaking through his fingers. He was pinned down, unable to scramble for better cover as bullets kicked up the dirt all around him. With no hesitation, Elizabeth started to make her way toward him, staying as low as possible and using the landscape to hide her movements. She knew it was a foolish risk, but she could not just leave him there, hurt and defenseless. She had made it about halfway to him when a bullet struck the ground just inches from her face. She looked up and saw one of Turner's men taking aim to fire again. Before the outlaw could pull the trigger, another shot rang out and the man was hit squarely in the chest. He tumbled backward and disappeared from view. Elizabeth turned to see who had rescued her and was shocked to see Harold holding a rifle, a look of fierce resolve on his face. "Harold!" she gasped in disbelief. "Go!" he yelled. "I will provide cover for you." Stunned but thankful, Elizabeth resumed her crawl to Ethan, finally reaching the safety of the boulder where he was trapped. "Elizabeth, what in the hell are you doing out here?" he demanded, his face white from pain and blood loss. "Saving you, it seems," she shot back, tearing a long strip from her petticoat to make a bandage for his shoulder. "Can you move?" "I will have to," he grimaced. "But we are completely pinned down here." Elizabeth carefully looked around the edge of the huge rock, studying their predicament. They were trapped in a crossfire with no obvious way to escape. Then she saw it, a dry creek bed that snaked down from the rocks above, ran near their position, and then continued on toward where the horses were hidden. "There," she said, pointing. "If we can get to that gully, we might be able to find our way out of here." Ethan looked where she was pointing, then nodded in agreement. "That is about 30 feet of open space to get there. It is a big risk." "I will go first and draw their fire," Elizabeth declared. "Then you can make a run for it." "No," Ethan said, grabbing her arm with his good hand. "It is far too dangerous." "I am smaller and faster," she insisted. "And you are hurt. This is the only way that makes sense." Before he could argue any more, Elizabeth bolted from behind the boulder, running in a zigzag pattern toward the creek bed. Bullets hit the ground all around her, but not a single one touched her. She dove into the relative safety of the gully, breathless from a mix of pure terror and relief. "Now!" she yelled to Ethan. Wincing from the pain, Ethan threw himself out from behind the boulder, running low to the ground toward the creek. More shots cracked through the air, but again, none of them found their target. He practically fell into the gully next to Elizabeth, breathing heavily. "That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I have ever witnessed," he panted. "I have been called both before," she answered with a shaky smile. "Can you make it to the horses?" Together, they began to move down the creek bed, keeping their heads low to avoid being seen. The gunfight was still raging behind them, but the noise got farther away with every step. They had almost made it to the trees where the horses were tied up, when Elizabeth heard someone yell from up above. She looked back and saw Silas Turner standing on a rocky ledge, his rifle aimed right at them. "Keller!" Turner roared. "You are a dead man!" Even with his wound, Ethan shoved Elizabeth behind him, using his own body as a shield. But before Turner could pull the trigger, another shot cracked through the air. The outlaw stumbled and dropped his rifle. He pitched forward, tumbling down the rocky hill until he landed in a heap at the bottom, not moving at all. Sheriff Davis appeared at the top of the ridge, his rifle still smoking. "I got him," he yelled down to them. "It is all over." The next few hours were a complete blur. The rest of Turner's gang, who were still alive after seeing their leader go down, gave up without much of a fight. The wounded men, including Ethan, were tended to by the posse's medical man. 2 of the sheriff's men had been killed in the fight and a few others were hurt, but Turner's gang had it much worse. Through the whole thing, Elizabeth never left Ethan's side. She refused to go even when the doctor was stitching up his bullet wound, which was a clean shot through the thick part of his shoulder that had missed the bone and any major arteries. And to her continued astonishment, Harold also stayed, staying quiet but always nearby, watching her with a thoughtful look in his eyes as she looked after Ethan. As the posse got ready to head back to Pine Creek with their prisoners and their dead, Harold finally walked over to Elizabeth, who was sitting next to Ethan's bedroll. "May I have a word with you?" he asked, his tone very formal. "In private." Elizabeth looked over at Ethan, who gave her a small nod. "Go on ahead. I am not going anywhere." She walked with Harold a little ways from the camp, wondering what on earth he could possibly want to say. The Harold she knew back in Denver would have never followed her into a dangerous situation, and he certainly would not have picked up a rifle to protect her. "You saved my life back there," she said, once they were far enough away that no one else could hear. "Thank you." Harold took off his glasses and cleaned them nervously with his handkerchief. "I surprised myself," he admitted. "I have never fired a gun at another person before." "I had not either, until a short while ago." They stood in a moment of uncomfortable silence before Harold spoke up again. "You love him, do you not? The cowboy, Mr. Keller." Elizabeth decided there was no reason to deny it. "Yes, I do." Harold nodded his head slowly, as if confirming something he had already figured out. "I could see it when I watched you two together. You have never once looked at me that way." "Harold, He held up a hand to quiet her. "Please let me finish. I came all this way to bring my fiancée back with me, back to the life we had planned. But that woman is not here anymore, is she? Maybe she never really was." Elizabeth felt a sudden wave of sympathy for him. "I am so sorry, Harold. I never wanted to cause you any pain." "I know," he sighed. And to be honest, I think we probably would have made each other quite unhappy over time. I wanted a proper wife for society, someone to host my dinner parties and look beautiful on my arm. But you were meant for something more than that. I see that clearly now. Elizabeth was truly touched by his surprising understanding. What will you do now? I will return to Denver, to my father's bank, Harold said. I will continue with my life, and perhaps I will look for a wife who actually desires the things I have to offer. He offered a small, sad smile. I do hope he makes you happy, Elizabeth. Thank you, she said quietly, feeling truly grateful for his kindness. As Harold walked back to the camp, Elizabeth stood there for a minute, looking out at the huge, open landscape all around her. So much had changed in such a little amount of time. She had arrived out west as a sheltered young woman whose entire future had been planned by other people. Now she stood here a different person, stronger, braver, and at last free to make her own choices. When she went back to Ethan's side, she saw he was sitting up, watching her come closer with those intense blue eyes that had fascinated her from the very start. Is everything all right? He asked, nodding his head toward Harold's retreating figure. Yes, Elizabeth said as she sat down beside him. It is better than all right, actually. Harold and I have reached an understanding. Oh? Ethan lifted an eyebrow. He is releasing me from our engagement, she told him. He could see that my heart is somewhere else. Ethan's serious expression softened. And just where would that be? I reckon you already know, Elizabeth said softly, her hand finding his, with a certain fellow who pulled me from a wrecked wagon and showed me what it means to be truly alive. A slow grin spread across Ethan's face, putting a real warmth in his eyes. That rancher does not have a whole lot to his name right now. His home is nothing but ashes, his horses are scattered to the wind, and his future is about as clear as mud. He has himself, Elizabeth said, plain and simple, and that is all I will ever want. Ethan drew her in close with his good arm, careful of his injury. Well, in that case, Elizabeth Prescott, once we are past all this and settled back in Pine Creek, would you do me the honor of being my wife? Not because anyone expects it, but because we are choosing this, you and me, with all our hearts. Elizabeth's heart just about took flight. Yes, she whispered, leaning in to seal her promise with a kiss. 1,000 times, yes. 2 months later, on a fine, crisp autumn day, Elizabeth Prescott became Elizabeth Keller in a simple ceremony in Pine Creek's little church. Martha Winters and Jesse Cooper stood up for them, his arm still in a sling but mending just fine. The ranch was slowly being put back together. They had managed to find most of the horses, including Midnight and her fast-growing colt. The people of the town, mighty impressed by the grit Ethan and Elizabeth showed against Sella Turner's gang, all came together to help. They brought lumber, offered their own hard work, and even dropped off housewarming presents for the newlyweds. Harold went on back to Denver after the wedding, having found some peace with Elizabeth's choice. As a parting gift, he had arranged for her inheritance to be released from the trust her father had set up, giving her the financial freedom she never thought she would have before turning 25. A wedding present, he had called it, to help you all rebuild your home. That evening, as the sunset painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Ethan and Elizabeth stood on the porch of their half-built house, looking out over their land. You ever have second thoughts? Ethan asked, his arm settled around her waist. About giving up Denver and that high society life you were born into? Elizabeth leaned right into him, feeling a kind of peace she had never known was possible, not for a single moment. This right here is where I belong. It is where we belong, even with all the trouble, the danger, and not knowing what tomorrow holds. Especially because of those things, she answered. They remind us that we are really living, not just going through the motions. Ethan turned her to face him, the last light of the day shining in his eyes. I never figured I would find a speck of happiness again after the war, he said, his voice low. I came out west to leave my ghosts behind, to build something that was just mine. I sure never expected to find someone to share it all with, someone who could understand the dark parts and the light inside me. And I never thought I would find freedom way out in this wild country, Elizabeth replied, touching his cheek gently. Or find courage when I was scared to death, or find love with a stranger who cut me loose and brought me home. Ethan kissed her then, a kiss that held all the promise of the future they would share, the ranch they would build back up together, the family they would start, and the life they had picked for themselves, free and clear. As the night settled around them and the stars started popping out one by one across that big old western sky, Elizabeth knew her real journey was just getting started. A journey of love and adventure, of tough times and happy times, side by side with the man who had saved her, not just once, but twice. First from the outlaws who had her in chains, and then from the invisible chains of a life that other people had planned out for her. In the years that followed, Elizabeth would often think about that moment she first opened her eyes and saw Ethan Keller riding toward her on that dusty plain. It felt like the end of one story, but it was really the beginning of a much bigger one. Their life together was not always a walk in the park. The western frontier demanded a lot of grit and hard work from anyone who tried to make a life there. But with every challenge, they stared down. Bitter winters, dry summers, the birth of their children, the growing of their ranch. Elizabeth and Ethan just held on tighter to that bond they had made in those first desperate days of danger and discovery. And on quiet evenings when the kids were all tucked in and the day's chores were done, they would sometimes sit together on the porch of their home, holding hands, and just marvel at the wild journey that brought them together. A bride chained to a wagon, and a cowboy with enough heart to set her free. And the love that gave them both the greatest freedom of all, the freedom to be exactly who they were always meant to be, together. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.